Chapter 14 deals with what are called the terrible 70s, and of course we're making reference to the 1870s. So here we are, we have an economic depression setting in across much of the United States in general, and California in particular, in the early 1870s. That's peculiar because you think here, this incredible accomplishment in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed, iron rails link the East Coast and the West Coast, the Civil War is over, everything's groovy, don't worry, be happy. Well, other things developed. Even though it was thought that the completion of this railroad would bring general prosperity, mainly because it was thought that goods exchanged between Europe and Asia would be transshipped by rail across the U.S., further enriching the seaport of San Francisco. There were some other things going on globally that played a role here. The Suez Canal in Egypt opened the same year as the railroad was finished, and it was a lot easier to transport goods from and to Europe and Asia by way of the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean than it was to go by rail across the United States. So that was a major factor. Because of the strength of the labor force and the clout that labor had during the building of the railroad, so to speak, state laws were passed establishing 8-hour work days and public work contracts. So labor had some strength and some stability there. But there were certain employers in San Francisco that carried on a nationwide propaganda campaign designed to bring as many new workers into California as possible, thus weakening labor's bargaining power, because there would always be people who would want to work for cheaper wages and less than desirable working conditions. To complicate matters, in 1869, with the completion of the railroad, thousands of workers were being laid off because they were no longer needed to construct said railroad, especially those thousands of Chinese laborers that were brought in across the Pacific. As a result of all this, chronic unemployment ensued, which would, in a few years, aggravate a depression and panic throughout parts of the United States and specifically in California. At this point, the Big Four, you remember them, Huntington, Crocker, Hopkins, and who was the other one? Huntington, Crocker, Hopkins, and why am I missing one? Stanford, of course. They considered getting out of the railroad business because they figured that freight and passenger revenues alone would never exceed the construction subsidies that they received. So they were thinking, well, you know, maybe we better bail and sell this railroad. But instead, they decided to stay in the railroad business in order to acquire more land grants, build regional railroads, and to control main seaport areas. Eventually, the Big Four and their various corporations had a monopoly on waterfront ports in the Bay Area. So in this case, they had their railroads, which were required to bring freight only to their ports that they controlled in the waterways. They prevented other railroads from approaching these ports, especially in San Francisco, because they politically controlled the State Board of Harbor Commissioners. Wow, conflict of interest. The Big Four were often made reference to as time went on in the 1870s as the octopus. They increased their control and holdings over so many things. They acquired control over the Southern Pacific Railroad in the late 1860s. They guaranteed them the means to construct a southern transcontinental route and the other routes in California. Construction of the Southern California line was awarded to Crocker's Dummy Corporation that we mentioned before. It was called the Contract and Finance Company, which extorted dollars and power from cities. Basically, they said to the cities, here's the deal. We're going to build a railroad to your town. If you don't agree with us, well, we're just going to build a railroad to some other town that we'll create. So they basically extorted money from cities, holding a gun to their head figuratively, if they decided they didn't want the railroad that the Big Four owned coming to their town. So the railroad would then bypass these cities that didn't want to produce the money in order to make that happen. They also controlled riverboat traffic, and newspaper editorials often called them the octopus. This is a political cartoon which first appeared in the newspaper The Wasp on August 19, 1882, and it's called The Curse of California by G. Frederick Keller. Later on, there was an author by the name of Frank Norris who in 1901 published a book called, in fact, I believe it was called The Octopus. which has to do with all of the graft and corruption that was going on during the 1870s and 1880s with the railroads in California that were owned by the Big Four. The Big Four then were able by 1880 to also control ocean transportation, and in no other region of the U.S. did a railroad enjoy such a degree of freedom from competition. These guys started out as being bastions of free market enterprise and all this kind of stuff, but they ended up basically owning just about every mode of transportation that existed at the time. They set the freight rates any way they wanted to. They set the highest charge on freight rates that the traffic would bear without completely bankrupting the shipper. In other words, the person who wanted to ship the goods. Of course, if they bankrupted the shippers, that would deprive the railroad of future business, so they just set the freight rates as high as they possibly could, as high as the market would bear. Some of the rates were high, some were low, some were published, and, well, some were secret, maybe some very special rates for preferred shippers and customers. They had the power to make or break just about anybody in the 1870s in California, the Big Four did. And then there were the land monopolies. By the mid-1870s, the railroads controlled about 11.5% of the entire land area of California. Now, back in 1862, Congress passed what was called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act encouraged land ownership in small farm units, implied family farms here. But if public land in California were fertile or located where transportation facilities would make it possible to market produce from that land, this land was usually engrossed by speculators before genuine homesteaders even had a chance to file a claim on it. The federal government also often sold swamplands in the Central Valley for as little as $1.25 an acre. But, the Central Valley wasn't necessarily a swamp all year round. I mean, there was spring snow melt and runoff into the valley, but in the summer and fall that would melt until the rains and snows would come again in the winter. Enter a guy named Henry Miller. He was born Heinrich Alfred Kreiser in Germany in 1847. He came to the United States when he was 19 years old. He knew livestock and he knew how to cut meat. So he started a butcher shop in San Francisco during the gold rush, but he branched out and acquired swamplands in the San Joaquin Valley for very little money. Eventually, Henry Miller controlled land along both banks of the San Joaquin River, stretching approximately from near today's Modesto to near today's Madera. Then Charles Lux came into the picture and he became a partner of Henry Miller. He was also from Germany and he looked after the firm's interests in San Francisco, business-wise and legal-wise, while Miller was in the interior looking after the ranches that they had acquired in the San Joaquin Valley. So here are pictures of Henry Miller and Charles Lux. Miller's picture is courtesy of the Merced Museum, and Charles Lux's picture is courtesy of a website called immigrantentrpreneurship.org. The expansion of the railroad network continued, and it did encourage agricultural settlement on the part of homesteaders. The Southern Pacific, remember this is one of the railroads that was owned by the Big Four, allowed settlers to occupy lands within the limits of its land grants, even though the railroad had not yet acquired full legal ownership of these lands. Future purchase prices were advertised to the settlers in very vague terms, something like from $2.50 an acre upward. Nonetheless, homesteaders grabbed these lands and they started to settle on them in the San Joaquin Valley in order to farm. This occurred in many areas of the Central Valley, but the one incident I'm referring to is an incident that occurred in a place called Muscle Slough, which is northwest of Hanford, in today's Kings County, California. So settlers came in with the promise of cheap land, even though they weren't actually buying the land yet because the railroad didn't have clear title to said land. Then when they did get title to clear land, the railroad offered to sell the land to the settlers from between $17 and $40 an acre, which is well above the understood price that the settlers were quoted. The settlers were angry because this included the value of the improvements that they made to the land, which the railroad didn't pay for. So on one particular day, a guy named Walter J. Crowe and a guy named Mills D. Hart purchased the lands from the railroad at $25 an acre. They had a lot of money and they could do this. They paid cash. The settlers assumed they were dummy purchasers hired by the railroad. Then on May 11, 1880, Crowe and Mills, accompanied by a U.S. Marshal, went to the site Muscle Slough to evict the settlers, the occupants. The result was that they were confronted by more than 20 settlers who were armed and mounted on horses. In this scuffle, 7 men were killed, including Crow and Hart. And this tragedy dramatized the intense popular sentiment against large landholdings by the railroads on the part of settlers. The settlers are not happy with these large landowners. The location of the Muscle Slough tragedy is noted by State Historic Marker 245, which you can actually find at the address of 5833 14th Avenue, which is in Kings County, between Everett Avenue and Elder Avenue, northwest of Hanford. You can actually find that marker today along that road. Then there was the business of gold and silver. Well, the gold situation played out in California. It was done. And silver was discovered near Virginia City, Nevada, which was called the Comstock Lode. And in the late 1850s and early 1860s, these finds of silver ore began to produce enormous wealth near Virginia City. So the rush of the 59ers was on from California to Nevada. Several mines in the Comstock Lode of western Nevada paid very well for several years. There were fraudulent sales of nearby properties which had no real access to this lode of silver ore. So in some cases, bonanza, which meant, a lot of silver, turned into what they call barasca, which means a failing mine. In 1864, the bottom sort of fell out, and the value of silver stocks fell by more than half at this point. Then in the 1870s, there was another bonanza. This did make enormous fortunes for a few men who controlled the richest mines and who could manipulate the silver stock market. Many of the most powerful men in the Comstock investments were associated with a guy named William Chapman Ralston, who organized the Bank of California in 1864. The bank came into control of many of the mines due to foreclosures, mines that weren't paying well, and deeper deposits of silver ore were eventually discovered, making the investors of this Bank of California quite rich. However, Ralston's supremacy in the Comstock Lode was challenged by 4 Irishmen by the name of McKay, Fair, Flood, and O'Brien. They made bigger silver discoveries. Ralston then overextended himself, betting that a nearby mine adjacent to the claims of those 4 men I just mentioned, also contained riches, which unfortunately it did not. Depositors heard this news that these mines that Ralston recently acquired were not panning out, so to speak. The investors made a run on the Bank of California to withdraw funds on August 26, 1875. The very next day, the directors of the Bank of California asked for and received William Ralston's resignation as president and CEO of the bank. Then he went for his customary swim in San Francisco Bay, and he drowned. His body was recovered a few hours later. Now, it's not known whether this was a suicide or whether Ralston actually simply drowned as an accident, but apparently, customarily, he would go swimming in the bay on a daily basis. A little bit more about William Ralston and the city of Modesto, California. Some years before this happened, the Central Pacific Railroad wanted to name a new town after Ralston because once upon a time he extended a loan to Leland Stanford, for which the Central Pacific was grateful. Ralston declined the offer of a town named in his name, so the railroad directors did it more indirectly by naming a town called Modesto along one of their rail lines. History does show, however, that modesty was not one of Ralston's greater qualities. So there you see the famous Modesto Arch. If you are from Modesto or you know about Modesto, you know there's this arch that goes across one of the main streets there, which says water, wealth, contentment, health. The city of Modesto, indirectly named for William Ralston of the Comstock Lode, who was anything but modest.